Peggy Shapiro, and I'm going to, okay, here's what's going to happen. You're here to hear the Memories of Jewish Portland, and we have 4 panelists. They're going to speak for about 10 to 20 minutes. We're going to have you hold your questions or comments until the end. That may be very hard to do. There's paper and pencil back there if you think that you're going to forget what you want to ask. But, so we have here Evelyn Litman, Chuck Mack, Rita Weisberg, and Phil Levinsky. Probably most of them need no introduction. Thank you so much. We have an hour and 45 minutes to do this. And we definitely want to save time for questions and comments at the end. I will try to plan a standing move around break for just a couple of minutes about halfway through. And we'll want to end on time because the second session starts at 3:15. There is a sign-in sheet, so if you haven't signed in coming in, on your way out, please sign in. And there's a piece of paper to have, she's from out of Portland, and then we'll move into Portland.
Out of towners, so to speak.
She's from away.
No, she's not.
Peggy,
She is not from away.
you think I should stand?
Yes.
Oh, whatever's comfortable. Yeah.
Yes.
Whatever you're
Okay.
comfortable.
Yeah, I think I don't mind standing. Yes, Peggy asked me to do this, and I said, well, I'm not from Portland. And she said, well, where are you from? I said, Saco. She said, close enough. I have one other Saco idea. Thank you so much. This is titled, My Life as an American Jewish Woman Growing Up in Maine. Can you all hear me? When Peggy Shapiro first called about this session, she said, in observance of the 350th anniversary of Jewish people coming to America, would you speak on your memories of living here in Maine? Now, I know I'm getting older, but do I remember 350 years? Without revealing my true age, I'll tell you how I felt and how I reacted as I was growing up Jewish in a small city in Maine. After I was married and moved to the big city, Portland that is, my feelings and reactions were somewhat different. I'll explain later. As a child, being Jewish was just a natural part of my life. I knew that was what I was, as my friends, neighbors, and playmates were either Catholic or Protestant. I never thought of my religion as a help or as a hindrance until I was older and realized that Christian holiday observances were not a part of my life. In fact, I think a little jealousy and envy entered into my thoughts as all the festivities, gift-giving, caroling, and visiting took place among my friends. In school, when the Christmas Carol booklets were handed out and we were all supposed to sing together, I believed it was the wrong thing to do. So I would just move my lips without actually making any sound. Either the teacher knew of my dilemma and said nothing to embarrass me, or she never noticed what I was doing. In my family, we were not strictly observant Jews, but mostly holiday attendees at the synagogue, and enjoyed celebrating the holidays with family gatherings. These included my grandfather, my mother's father, and my only grandparent, aunts, uncles, and cousins from Sanford and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My 2 brothers, who were 10 and 12 years older than I, went to Hebrew school and were bar mitzvahed. I have no recollection of these celebrations since I was not even 3 years old at the time of the second bar mitzvah. When the time came for me to be enrolled in Hebrew school, the frightening experience lasted only a few weeks for a number of reasons. It was an Orthodox synagogue which did not welcome girls into the class, and I was the only girl in the class. The rabbi was an older man with a full beard, and that's saying it nicely. Elizabeth Rabbi Nathanson, you remember? and walked around with a heavy wooden ruler, which he constantly banged on the desks. And most of the boys were, in a word, unruly. It's difficult to tell you all the things that those boys did in class to really scare the life out of me and aggravate the rabbi. After my complaints, my parents agreed that I would no longer have to attend, and that ended my Hebrew education until I studied with my children as they attended a conservative Hebrew school. My parents were well known and respected in both the Jewish and the secular community, since my father owned a shoe store in Biddeford and eventually in some other communities. Both were active in many organizations, including the Synagogue Board, the Auxiliary, Hadassah, B'nai B'rith, Parent Teachers Association, professional organizations, and many social clubs, such as bridge groups, mahjong, poker, and gin rummy. They even served as air raid wardens and plane observers during World War II. It was great fun and actually educational for me to help them study the pictures and learn to recognize all the different airplanes. From the previous information, it would seem as if we were almost completely assimilated into the community. But this idea was not exactly correct. We were still looked upon as different, strange, maybe even with horns, as the old saying goes. As I reflect on those years, there were two painful incidents of obvious prejudice that happened to me. One happened when I was probably 11 or 12 years old, which for a girl is an extremely sensitive time in one's life. 6 or 7 of my close friends decided to form a secret club called the Sub-Debs, and I was not invited to join. When I made my hurt feelings known, I was told that Janice's mother said no Jews allowed. The second incident occurred when I was 17 and a senior in high school. The guidance counselor, Catherine Mahaney, who was a good friend of my mother, I had applied to Pembroke College, which at that time was a part of Brown University. Since I ranked third in my class and was active in many school activities, there should have been no problem with my acceptance, so we believed. After some delay, we received our refusal, which was a shock even to the guidance counselor. Miss Mahaney was informed that the Jewish quota at Pembroke had been filled, and no more applicants of the Jewish faith could be accepted for the coming year. Since state universities could not impose quotas, I attended the University of Maine and transferred to a private college, Simmons, after my sophomore year. I later found out that Simmons had no such restrictions and is, to this day, one of the most liberal colleges in the country. Also, I don't know where Peggy is, but Peggy also went to Simmons. In case I have given the wrong impression, I want to emphasize that my growing up years were happy, relaxed times, unconcerned with prejudice and ill feelings. I had many friends, and we often spent time in each other's homes, ate meals there, and enjoyed sleepovers, as young girls still do today. During the years when I was 9 to 13, I spent each summer at Campfire Girls Camp in Maine. I met quite a few Jewish girls from the Portland area at this camp, and we remained friends throughout my life. I'll put a little side note in here. My friend Charlotte Silver was at camp with me. This was not, however, a Jewish camp, and therefore I often ate foods that I never knew existed or tasted before. As you realize that these were the 1930s and early 1940s, there had to be some impact on my life and the lives of my family concerning the events going on in the world. I can remember my father sitting beside the big radio in the living room each night and listening to the news from Europe. He would sit there and sometimes curse, of course in Yiddish, and on occasion I even remember tears streaming down his face. Although I did not completely understand what was happening, I was deeply moved and inwardly frightened by his reactions. As time went by, World War II came much closer to home. My brother Fred enlisted in the U.S. Air Corps, and after training in Texas, he was sent to England, where he flew the enormous B-17s that were used to drop bombs on our enemy, Germany. To me, he was a hero, and he was bombarded with my adolescent letters. My older brother Norbert was rejected by the Army because of a physical deformity and was feeling upset and ashamed. As a result, he volunteered to work in a munitions factory in Iowa just to satisfy his need to be a part of the war effort. He had many interesting stories to relate when he finally returned, a hero in his own way. As it probably happened to most of you here today, the war affected everyone, Gentiles and Jews alike. Somehow, the Jewish people in this country seem to strive even harder to show their patriotism. My friends and I even learned to make Afghan squares, socks, scarves, and mittens to be sent overseas. Going back to my relationship with the relatively few Jewish contemporaries in my community, I can honestly say that my friendships didn't start to form until I was old enough to ride the bus alone to Biddeford to meet for a movie or an outing, followed by lunch at the Puritan, a local luncheonette. After being asked by my friends from camp to join Iota Phi sorority, my parents were able, I added this, to bring me to Portland on Sunday afternoons so that I could attend the sorority meetings at different members' homes, followed by usually a visit to the teenage room at the Jewish Community Center, which was in the basement and had booths and music and dancing, and it was really fun. This was a wonderful and exciting part of my life, and I loved spending time with my Jewish friends and cousins. I was even brave enough to ride the bus back to Saco at 10 o'clock at night and have my father pick me up at the bus stop. While I attended high school, my parents finally relented and allowed me to date non-Jewish boys, since there was only one Jewish boy in my school. He was shorter than I, which was considered taboo at 16. As a matter of fact, we became good friends later on in our lives. My parents informed me rather sternly that once I was in college, I could date only Jewish boys. Did I listen to my parents? No, of course not. One date, and my loving cousin, a sophomore at the same school, came to me and said, "You must date only Jewish boys or you will have a bad reputation." She, I listened to. Thank goodness. A couple of weeks before I left for college, I met my future husband, Bob, at Old Orchard Beach. Our parents had been trying to introduce us, but neither of us would have anything to do with such arrangements by our parents. We did spend some time together on the beach and on a couple of dates. Bob even got to meet my brothers, who had a great time teasing him about wearing shorts on a date. I'll skip right over my college years to my life in Portland after we were married here at Temple Bethel. As I mentioned in the beginning of this saga, my life in Portland was very different from my younger days spent in Saco. Our daily living, activities, friends, and social life were almost exclusively centered on the Jewish community. We immediately joined Temple Bethel, the Jewish Community Center, Hadassah, and other Jewish women's groups. In our apartment complex, I did make some non-Jewish friends, as well as through college alumni groups, but the majority of my contacts were with Jewish people. The arrival of children into our lives seemed to strengthen our bonds with our religion. It was important to both of us, and certainly to our parents, that we continue to keep our beliefs and ideals alive in our children, especially after so many were lost in the Holocaust. This does not imply that we wanted to isolate ourselves from our non-Jewish friends and acquaintances, but only that our participation in temple and center activities would set an example for our children to follow. Our life here in Portland has been happy, rewarding, and fulfilling, with most prejudice being of a sporadic and occasional nature within the community. These include the desecration in the cemetery and exclusion from certain clubs, hotels, resorts, and restaurants, which have mostly been eliminated by law. I'm certain that our 4 children would have very different stories to tell about growing up Jewish in Portland, and they probably would not agree with our feelings, but that's a story for another day. Thank you for allowing me to speak here today. It was indeed my pleasure.
Okay, I'm so happy, and I don't mean to be sweet or saccharine, to see everyone here today. And I will only dwell on this for a moment. Having lost my wife, you people are very important to me. I never realized really quite how much until just recently. So I'll end at that, but I am very, very happy to see such an attendance here today. And happy even to see people older than myself. Because, you know, you always kind of want to hope that someone is older than you as you're going along. Because when you're the oldest, there's danger. You don't like it. Or at least I always was concerned about it. But I'll make my story very brief as far as introduction. It isn't a story, actually, just an introduction about the Portland, Maine that I knew as I was growing up. My mother had a dress shop opposite the State Theater, and at that time the State Theater was a very, very nice theater. And my mother established a dress shop on top of what was the Presto Lunch. It was a small little Greek lunch just across the street, and she had a dress shop, as I say. She had a very, very difficult life in trying to bring up, and I won't go into it personally, but in trying to bring up both my brother and myself. When she established this dress shop, it was the only alternative she had. She was lucky that they allowed her to pay $40 a month for an apartment, so to speak, which encompassed the dress shop in the front and our living quarters in the back. My brother, myself, and me. My brother was 8.5 years older than I was. And in time, she became extremely successful. She was a very outgoing, and I think those who perhaps might remember her, a very beautiful and charming woman. She made a wonderful success of her dress shop. And I was just a little kid at the time going to what was then the Park Street School, which was kind of like right around the corner. If you know where Park Street is, they had a school called the Rosie True School. From there, I went to Butler School, which was up on Pine Street, and got to intermingle with people from, Danforth Street, Spring Street, West Street, Pine Street. From Butler School, went to Portland High School. This was in 1941, 1942. And after having been very successful at delivering papers and selling papers on the street, I moved up to a job at my uncle's store in South Portland. He opened a store called Stewart's Men's Shop. He left Sulkowich's, which was down on, I guess, was it? 4th Street. Left Sulkowich's to go out and open up a store on his own. This was during the war now, 1939 he went out there, or 1940. And of course, he became also quite, if I may, not boastfully, but he was pretty successful. He did a good job at it. He initially started out by waving at all the people that came across the bridge from South Portland to Portland, you know. And they said, "Louis, what are you doing here?" He says, "I left Selkwitch's and I've opened up my own store." Well, the shipyard was just a little bit, you know, beyond that, over on, what is it, Front Street in South Portland, something like that. And Henry Kaiser I think it was Henry Kaiser who had established this. Henry Kaiser once said if he'd known what he was getting into, he would never have done what he did. However, it too was very successful, and I think they were putting out a ship every month, possibly in those times. You folks can tell me that no, probably. But every 30 days, a ship was launched from South Portland, called Liberty ships. And I worked for my uncle in this store, and we used to get fellas in, you know, from the shipyard. So yes, it was a wonderful thing, and we had the Champ, which was right next door. This was a beer parlor. And guys used to come in, they were all from Aroostook County and from everywhere. At 4 o'clock they would come in to have a beer after they'd worked. Well, Red Shane, whom I don't think anyone here remembers or knows, had the beer parlor called the Champ. And when they came in at 4 o'clock, he had already had 2 quarts. And he didn't want anybody from out of town coming into his beer parlor. So he would hook up his hose and spray everybody, get out of here. That was Red Shane. Okay. But I worked at my uncle's store for years, 1942 to 1946. The only thing I can really remember about Portland, this is how sophisticated I was going from the corner of High and Congress. Now, High and Congress had the Greyhound bus right at the corner. Across the street was the Walgreens drugstore, if you remember. From the Walgreens drugstore, you had a hot dog place. You can get hot dogs for 5 cents. No, hot dogs were 5, yeah, and hamburgers were 10 cents. Troiano's had their little fruit store, if you remember, right below that. Then there was the Eastland Hotel. But the only area I remember was from High and Congress down to Portland High School, to go to high school, get on the bus at Monument Square. Now, Monument Square was quite a complex in those days, if I may say, because everything almost originated from Monument Square and the buses. They had a fellow there who, rain or shine, that was his job. He had a whistle and a heavy coat, and he, you know, he timed the buses going to South Portland, wherever the heck they were going, you know, during the war, and the buses were loaded because that was primarily the means of transportation. Not too many people were driving cars because gasoline was rather rationed. So that was the only really world that I knew, was Portland High, going from High and Congress to Portland High School, getting on the bus out to my Uncle Louis' store in South Portland, working at night, and then coming back down at the center. Now, we had a great basketball team. I'm happy to see that Jerry Rosen was here, because he was a predecessor of mine. But if you can see Jerry Rosen right now, you may not believe that he was a fantastic ball player. Basketball, and I think he also played, he was the only Jew at Portland Junior College, I think, that ever made on the team, and they had a great team. But we, following you, Jerry, had a wonderful team of my age group, and we used to play the high schools and really compete with them. I guess that was about it. I knew the Oaks. The Oaks was a great place. The pond at the Oaks, I don't know how it is now, but in those days, it was a very, very popular place for us because we went skating there. And I'll end with this little story. I don't know who it was. There were a couple of Jewish fellas that ran that little store there. And they used to sharpen blades. Did you ever go down to the Oaks skating?
Harry Cohen and Venner.
In Venner, okay. They were, I hate to say it, I'm not proud of them, really. The way they conducted their business, because they were awful tough guys. So we used to put our shoes out on, you know that little island there? You said you went skating, the little island. You'd put your shoes there and you'd go skate. You'd come back and put your shoes on. You couldn't put them on because they were frozen, right? So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck, very much. And Rita.
May I say something? Your brother brother Macy, Martin and I were very close friends in high school.
Of course.
You remember the high school fraternities in those days?
The Mu Sigma.
He and I got paddled together, and then we went on to Portland Junior College. And your mother, she was something special too. She was a beautiful lady,
She was
and
nice.
her sweet personality.
Yes, she was. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's so hard not to talk after each person and offer your own stories, but we'll go on to Rita. You're next.
Okay.
Thanks.
First of all, I want to tell you that even though this panel has been referred to as the elders, I am the youngest one on the panel. I was born at home and delivered by Dr. Melnick, a Jewish doctor. I think he did a wonderful job, and I hope you agree. At the time, my parents already had 2 other daughters. The oldest was Judy, who was 4 years older than Marcia. Marcia was 5 years older than I was. Dr. Melnick came into the house with 2 suitcases. My tongue's a little thick. And told Marcia that in one there was a little girl, and in the other there was a little boy. Marcia chose the suitcase that I was in. She was always very smart. Our family doctor was Dr. Henry Tabachnik. I grew up on Munjoy Hill. When I was very little, we lived on Vesper Street, across the street from the Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Lewitis. There were many Jewish neighbors at that time. When I was 6, we moved to Wilson Street because we needed a bigger place. My mother was expecting a baby, which turned out to be twin girls. It was hectic growing up in a family of 5 girls. Our house was a few streets from the Eastern Promenade, and we spent most of our summer days either taking picnics to eat on the grass or going swimming in the East End beach. During my very young days, I played mostly with the kids that lived in the neighborhood, some Jewish and some non-Jewish. I had a very happy home life. My mother was a very intelligent woman that instilled in me many of the values that I have today. She did not like to argue and always saw the best in people. My home was always full of my sister's friends, including Jean Meyer and Phil Levinsky. Jean used to play the piano and sing the Greener Kazina and cry real tears. We had so much fun. My parents had a pinochle and bridge game with the same couples that met each week for about 40 years. One of the couples was Dave Astor's parents. Another was Maxwell and Eddie Scheibel's parents. They loved my mother's cooking. She was a very good cook and made all the traditional Jewish dishes. My uncle was in the potato business in Presque Isle and would send us these huge bags of potatoes, and my mother would grate potato latkes for all of her friends. Everybody loved to come to my house. There were times when my mother's friends were in one room, my father's friends were playing pinochle in another room, my sister Judy's friends were dancing in the living room, and Marcia's friends were in another room. We made our own entertainment, playing the piano and singing around the piano, putting on mock weddings and so forth. It was a lively home. If you kept a strictly kosher Passover, your foods were extremely limited. The only cake we made was sponge cake. We used to line the 9x13 pans with shelf paper or brown paper, and after we took the cakes from the oven, we would peel the paper off of the sponge cakes and pray that they didn't fall. My birthday very often fell on Passover, so my birthday cake would very often be a sponge cake. I remember a grocery store on Congress Street that sold Passover candy. They had these huge blocks of jelly candy, and for a nickel they would cut you a big piece. My school was then on Monument Street, and after I ate my lunch at home, I would stop at the store and get a piece of that candy. There were no supermarkets to shop in, and we had many corner grocery stores within walking distance to our home. During World War II, it was good to be a friend of Bob Couvant's grandmother, Mary Astor. She and her husband ran a corner grocery store on the next street to us. Whenever there was sugar or bananas, she would let us know. She kept them under the counter. If I remember correctly, the sugar was rationed and we had to use ration coupons to buy it. Another store was Blocks. It sold groceries and little of everything, a miniature Walmart. It was a few blocks further from us. Mrs. Block was a sister to Mrs. Astor and Mr. Scheibel. We lived in a duplex house. There were 4 families, 2 on each side. At one point, there was a French family that lived downstairs. The woman liked my mother very much, but always asked my mother if she was sure she was Jewish. Apparently, she had a very negative opinion of Jews, and my mother did not fit the stereotype of what she pictured as a Jew. We did get along in spite of the woman's prejudice. It was comments like that that made us feel more comfortable associating mainly with our fellow Jews. Also, the Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Greenbaum, lived across the hall for a time. He had a beautiful young blonde Israeli wife named Miriam. When my sister Marcia's male friends came to my house, they always rang the rabbi's bell by mistake. So they could see the beautiful young Rebbitzin. Phil Levinsky was one of those My father's mother lived on Newbury Street, across from the old Sherita Synagogue. She rented an apartment from Mrs. Goldstein, whose granddaughter married Milton Berle. Every week I would take the bus to my piano lesson, which also was on Newbury Street, and visit my grandmother. My piano teacher was Mary Goldman, who just passed away at the age of 95. Al Goldman's sister. I started taking piano lessons from her at the age of 10 and went by bus by myself to the lessons. I would then go downtown or go to the library. I was very independent and did not have parents driving me around as they do today. In school, in the music classes, we had to sing the beautiful Christmas carols. I used to sing them, but leave out the name Christ. I remember helping to decorate a Christmas tree in the 2nd grade. I loved decorating that tree, only because it was so beautiful, and naturally we never had one at home. I stayed home from school on all of the Jewish holidays. It was not hard to make up the work if you were a good student. They did not push the kids as much as they do now. I never experienced any prejudice in school. When I went to junior high school, I began to socialize with only Jewish kids. I had a best friend, Mary Ann, who is still a very dear friend of mine, even though she does not live in Portland. We belonged to Young Judea at that time. Our leader was Yetta Cope, a sister-in-law to Mitchell and Arthur Cope. We used to collect for Jewish National Fund with the blue cans from all the Jewish people. I played the piano at the various synagogue sisterhood and Hadassah meetings for the entertainment portion of their programs and enjoyed all of the older people. At a Federation meeting, I remember playing Hatikva when President Roosevelt's son and his wife, Faye Emerson, were the guests of honor. During the high holidays, I would go to Sheriff Tefillah Synagogue and visit with my grandmother in the upper part of the synagogue where only the women sat. I loved to hear the cantor and the choir sing, but did not understand any of the prayers. We always had new clothes for the holidays, and the girls always wore hats. We also would visit the Etz Chaim synagogue to see what was going on there. It was a time to not only get a little Yiddishkeit, but to socialize with your friends. On the upper portion of the Sherah Tefillah Synagogue, there was a very nice ladies' lounge where my friends and I spent a little time. We never rode on Jewish holidays. By this time, my friend Mary Ann lived on Pleasant Avenue, and we would walk from my house near the promenade to the synagogue on Newbury Street, and then to her house on Pleasant Avenue. And this was done with spiked heels, you understand. Most of the Jewish families had moved to the Woodfords area of Portland by the time I was in high school, but I still continued to socialize only with Jewish teenagers. In high school, my social life was mostly at the Jewish Community Center on Cumberland Avenue. We had a center youth lounge where we could play the jukebox and dance, or just sit and be with one another. It was a home away from home. We had a bowling alley on the top floor, and this was the place that most Jewish activity in the city took place, including all the Jewish sorority and fraternity dances. I was president of the Delta Kappa sorority in my senior year of high school. Our sorority would sell raffles and donate things to the Jewish Home for the Aged. I think the raffles were only 5 cents each. 2 other sorority sisters and I were asked to speak at a Friday evening service at Temple Bethel before we had our own building. The topic was why people were not coming to services. And each one of us wrote her own speech from a different viewpoint. Our sorority was also asked by Temple Bethel if any of us in the sorority had musical talent. Since Harriet Serlick and I both played the piano, we volunteered to be in a mother and daughter program at the Temple. When we went to the first meeting, we were rather shocked to be asked if we were soprano or alto. We went along with it and did participate in the group. I haven't heard any complaints. It was customary for local businesses to search out people who studied advanced secretarial studies in my school. There was a position for a secretary at the Canal National Bank, an old Yankee bank that was established 125 years prior. The head of the business section of my school sent me to apply for the position. He told me, however, that since I was the best qualified person he had, if they did not hire me, I should not feel badly, and that it would have been because of my religion. Unbeknownst to me, he told them at the bank that if they did not hire me because of my religion, he would never send another person to them. Anyway, I was hired and was the first Jewish girl in the city of Portland to work at a bank. I never was shown any direct anti-Semitism, but one day, the head of the investment company that was next door to the bank came in to see my boss. My boss and I shared an office. The investment man proceeded to say to my boss that a very decent Jew came in to his place to examine the tax returns. My boss knew that it was Eddie with whom I was engaged at the time, and he was rather upset for me, but they quickly went on to another subject. I always had a deep feeling about Judaism. When I first met my husband, Eddie, one of the things that impressed me about him was his Jewish education and love of the religion. We had to return from our honeymoon sooner than we would have liked to because Eddie was teaching Hebrew school at the temple part-time. Several years later, I taught Sunday school at the temple. In the beginning, 4-, 5-, and 6-year-old children were all in the same class. I believe we had 49 children. I had 2 helpers. One of them was Bonnie Godfrey, who many of you know sang with the Metropolitan. Our children went to Hebrew school at the temple and became bat and bar mitzvah. It was a time when the bar mitzvah service was the most important part of the day, and not the lavish parties that are now being held. Cantor Messerschmidt trained the children to perfection, and the services were beautiful, with the choir singing and the organ's accompaniment. During the Saturday service, we had a children's choir, which also added to the beauty of the service. The children attended Kadima and USY. We kept a kosher home and celebrated all the holidays at home with special foods and decorations. Our seders were always very special. Since my dining room was small, the seder was limited to my family, parents, and sisters' families. But one year, we had a third seder a week later and invited just friends. My parents were in the Barron Center during their 90s. After my mother died and my father was unable to leave the Barron Center, they let us use their lovely daycare room, and our family, which numbered about 25, brought all of our home cooking with all the traditional foods and disposable plates and had a wonderful Seder there. Channel 6 came and featured a segment of their news with part of our Seder. When my children were old enough for me to go back to work, I went to work at the Portland Water District. For most of the 20 years that I worked there, I was the only Jewish person out of 250 employees. I found that the people were very interested to learn about my religion and took it upon myself to tell them many things. There were several times when someone would make a comment about Jewing someone down, and I always called that person to task about the remark. One young man, after I told him that I was insulted with his remark, profusely apologized and sent me a beautiful Hallmark card saying how sorry he was. There was a man that I worked with that always commented that all Jews were rich. So one day I told him that if he became Jewish, that he would become rich too. He said that he was not smart enough to be Jewish. I told him that as soon as he had the operation, that he would become smart. I would hold up my scissors. Eddie and I were blessed with many friends. We have celebrated birthday anniversaries with dinners, humorous plays, and roasts with the same 10 couples for about 50 years. The Levinskys, Brins, and Weisbergs hosted 2 parties at the South Portland Boys Club and called them country fairs. We called ourselves the Weisbrinskys, a combination of Weisberg, Brin, and Levinsky. They were wonderful parties and are on videotape. If there is enough of a demand, they will be shown next year at the movies as part of the Jewish Film Festival. My wonderful husband and many of our dear friends have passed away, but I treasure their memory, and I also treasure the new friendships that I have made, many of you who are here today. Thank you.
Another wonderful one. Okay, Bill, thank you.
I had very full school days as a young person. I attended a kindergarten on the corner of Pitt Street and Oakdale Street. It was called the Oakdale Kindergarten, and my teacher was Miss Davis. And I remember the first day my mother brought me there. I wasn't quite 4 yet, and I kicked her in the shin. I didn't want to be left there without my mother. But anyway, I got through the year all right, and I remember the second year, we went the first year, which was kindergarten, and then the second year they called sub-primary. And we went in the afternoon with sub-primary. And I remember I was a shy kid, and I remember one day I had to go to the bathroom to relieve myself very badly, but I was too shy to go to the bathroom, so I held it for the several hours, and I hurried home as fast as I could, and I made it to the back door, but that was as far as I could make it. Yeah, I'll never forget that. It was a very warm feeling. I attended Nathan Clifford School on Falmouth Street. I remember we had a 1-hour break, and we used to walk home for lunch each day, and then we'd come back for the afternoon session until 3 p.m. Then off to Hebrew School on Pearl Street. I remember piling and squeezing into a cab where Stanley Blumenthal picked on Jack Novick all the time. He used to take off his hat and hide him. And the Silverman twins, Marty and Milty, a comedy duo, they kept us entertained as we struggled for space. There was, we were piled 3 deep in that taxi cab. After that, we got a little older. I remember taking the streetcar at the corner of Falmouth Street and Brighton Avenue. That was after we had the cab arrangements, and it cost us a nickel to take the trolley. And it was a lot of fun. It was a very spirited ride. The in-town trolley stop was on the corner of Congress and Temple Street. And Owen Mack had a store on the corner of Congress and Temple. That property was owned by his father, Jacob Mack. And he had bulk candies. And for 19 cents a pound, he sold gels, which were spearmint leaves and orange slices and, things of that sort. And if you had a nickel, which was very rare, you could get a quarter-pound bag of candy. I mean, that much candy for a nickel was more than enough to share. That was delicious. There was a lot of small stores in those days, although next to his store was the Colonial Theater, and that was run by his brother. Let's see if I've got his name down here. Let's see, and his father had a hardware store behind him. And the Colonial Theater was 10 cents in those days. Next door to the Colonial Theater was the Tiger Shoe Store. And if you bought a pair of shoes there, it was exciting. You got a pair of movie tickets to go to the movies. And, oh yeah, and if you bought a pair of boots that had a slot in it where you could keep your Boy Scout knife. That block had a lot of small stores. There was also the Shore Brothers City Hall fruit store. And I remember the Shore Brothers. Of course, one was Mr. Shore was Evelyn and Calvin Shore, who were twins, and Louise Shore's father, and then Barney Shore, Abba Sholom's father. And they wore felt hats all day long while they worked. I remember that. And when you walked by, one of them was always polishing a piece of fruit in the window. Yeah. And next door was a shoemaker who actually made shoes in the window. And then there was a bank there. And this is across from the City Hall. And then you crossed the street, and the paper was there in those days. And then you'd cross the street to go to Pearl Street where the Hebrew school was. And on the corner of Myrtle and Congress, next to the City Hall, was Livingston's clothing store. And in later years, Rita Weisberg's father worked there with them. And they had a tailor upstairs, an independent tailor by the name of Terunium. It was a long, long staircase, and Livingston was known for pants. He used to advertise pants, and they were always running up and down stairs to get their pants shortened for the customers. It cost 25 cents to shorten a pair of pants in those days. 12.5 cents a leg. Next to Livingston's was the Taliento brothers had a little tiny cigar and tobacco store. It was called Tally's. And next to that was Mann's furniture store. And they sold secondhand furniture. And then there was a hardware store in later years run by Irving Kronsberg. On the corner of Pearl and Congress, on Congress, there was a beautiful church, which isn't there anymore, and then you'd go around the corner and there was an apartment house, a big brick apartment house, and then there was the Hebrew school. Now, we went to Hebrew school 7 days a week. We had to be there Monday through Thursday for classes from 4 to 6. And on Fridays, we had classes for 1 hour from 4 to 5. And from 5 to 6, we had to attend Shabbos services, which we enjoyed a lot. That was the best part of Hebrew school. We loved to sing the Hebrew songs. Yeah, I still love to sing. Elizabeth had my voice insured for $10,000. But I don't know what she did with the money. The thing I remember most about the Hebrew school was the odor from the basement.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, remember that? That's where the latrines were and what have you. It was mostly boys at the Hebrew school. There was a few girls. I remember Molly Schwartz, Cook Cinnamon went, and Bookstein girls went. And that was about it, maybe a Clayman girl or two. And the teachers were, well, there was varied teachers. We loved a Rebbe Modes. He was a beautiful, sweet man with a beard, and it was yellowed because he smoked. And the way he smoked was he had a cigarette holder. And he used to take a cigarette and cut it in 4 pieces. And he'd put a little piece in the holder and light it up. And of course it was very hot. He used to scorch his beard, but he was a lovable guy. Harold was there, he remembers. And then we had Rebbe Knockin'. Yeah, and his nickname was Rebbe Knockout. He was a very frustrated guy, and the kids used to take terrible advantage of him. When he turned his back, they'd throw things at him. Then he'd get mad, and he always had that ruler in his hand. And he wouldn't just hit you with it, he'd stab you with it. I'll never forget that.
It was a gavel.
Yeah, you were there, A.B. I think they made about $7 a week in those days. And a living wage was more like $10 or $12 a week. And if you made $25 a week, you probably had a car and lived in a single house. Let's see, service on Friday night, we enjoyed that very much. Saturdays, we had to be at Hebrew school because we were required to be at services. And Sunday was just another school day at Hebrew school. So 7 days a week we were there, which kind of curtailed our involvement in the neighborhood activities with our friends. But that was only for a period of, what, 6 or 7 or 8 years. Sunday was payday at the Hebrew school. We used to pay our tuition weekly. They had a little office there, and we used to go in there and give them our coin every week. If things were very tough and you were poor, you tried to give them a nickel a week. Most people gave them a dime or 15 cents. I remember Jack Novick, he came from a wealthy family. They ran the Hub Furniture Company, and he used to give them a quarter. And his father's partner, Abram Simon's son, Sammy, used to give him 50 cents a week. They were the biggest payer at the Hebrew school. But you know, 50 cents was quite a bit of money in those days because gasoline was 5 for $1 all the time, and sometimes 8 and 9 for $1 if there were gas wars. Yeah.
Could I interrupt for just 1 second?
Yeah.
I'm the Hebrew school and the teachers.
Yeah.
One time I got out of the classroom, got onto the phone, called my mother and says, I think he wants to kill me. She says, don't be silly. Go back into the class.
Chuck and I were in the same class. You know who was lucky to get out of that class alive was Cal Schuler. Knockin' tried to kill him. It was terrible. Yeah. Well, anyway,
Phil, there was one more thing about that Hebrew school.
Amy was in the class too.
When the Rebbe chased us across the room, the person nearest the window would open it up and he would go through the window. That was our lifeline. And about the smell, there was a trough downstairs.
They never followed us downstairs, the Rebbe's.
Oh, boy. Well, after Hebrew school, when I was very young, we first went home in the taxi. And it was just as big a crowd going home as it was going there. I mean, we were piled in 3 deep. And the taxi driver couldn't drive everyone to their home, so he would leave you as close as he could to the house on a main artery. And I can remember Arnold Couvent, Big Arnold Couvent, there was 2 Arnold Couvents. Big Arnold Couvent told me in later years that they used to leave him off on the corner of Bedford Street. He used to walk up Bedford Street to get to Surrender Street home. And there was a gang there, and he used to have to fight his way home. By the same token, I think Chucky had to fight his way home. Yeah. And let's see, after the cab, I remember around 1938, I was about 12 by then, Jack Novick's brother, Dave Novick, Abba Sholem, he had a brand new 1938 Dodge car with a rumble seat. And didn't we love to ride in that rumble seat, even in wintertime. He used to take us back and forth. And then as I got a little older, around Bar Mitzvah time, I used to walk up to my father's store, which was just 2 or 3 blocks away, and I'd come home with him after he closed. And I would walk by little stores, and one of them was Sorensen's Bakery, which is directly opposite Lincoln Park. And if you had 2 cents, you were lucky, because you could get a jelly donut. Boy, it was like a grenade. When you bit into it, it exploded, and you got covered with jelly. That was wonderful. And I'd ride home with my father in his 1933 Chevrolet. And I remember after the war started, we had gas rationing, and you were only allowed 4 gallons a week. And we'd go to Pearl Street, then the Pearl Street Hill all the way down to Marginal Way. My father would shut off the motor, and we would coast. He would put it in neutral. Because that 4 gallons had to go a whole week. It was quite a thing, yeah. I was bar mitzvahed at the Etzgeim Synagogue on Congress Street. I still go there every Saturday. It gets to be a habit. And I remember I was frightened at my bar mitzvah. I don't remember too much about it, but I got through it. And supposedly we had the first sit-down luncheon after the bar mitzvah downstairs. And my mother's half-sister, Cooney Weinstein, helped my mother bake the goods. We had a real great meal. And let's see. After that, I only went to Hebrew school for maybe a couple of months, but I was very active in an organization called Young Israel. We had a lawyer in Portland by the name of I. Edward Cohen. He lived on Munjoy Hill. And I. Edward Cohen was a divorce lawyer, but he was an unusual divorce lawyer. He made an effort to talk people out of getting divorced. And he was the organizer of Young Israel. And we loved to go to those services because it was fun to sing those songs. And our services every Saturday were at the Congress Street Shul. And Sunday mornings we had a service. And every other Sunday we would be at the Sheretah Synagogue on Newbury Street. And we'd have a breakfast and have a service. And at those breakfasts I had my first cup of coffee at 13 or 14 or 15 years old. And I remember one day being at the Sheretah Synagogue, which was a beautiful synagogue. It was a much nicer facility. About that time, around 1940, and the first thing he had me do there was take the 10 dozen reams of white handkerchiefs, which we sold for a nickel, and bag 6 of them in a little paper bag for a quarter. You remember those, Harold? Harold worked in the store at that time, and his mother, my dear Aunt Sarah, I'm half Romano. And my Aunt Sarah used to bring Harold his lunch every day, a half a chicken. And he used to sit up in the office and have that. Oh, we had some great times.
That was lunch, though.
Yeah, kept looking at his watch. Yeah. And I remember Harold had a friend called Jimmy Cates, let him rest in peace, and Jimmy used to come in the store on a Friday or Saturday night to pick Harold up. My father was always mad at him because my father didn't want Harold to leave too early. Yeah, you know, when I was born in 1926, I was born in Dr. Adam P. Layton's private hospital uptown. And my mother had every faith in Dr. Layton, and we lived in an apartment over the store. It was a 4-room apartment. We had hardwood floors. It was a nice apartment, but my father wanted us to have a better location, and we moved into a 3-family house on the Prom. And we lived there the winter of 1929. And it was an exceptionally cold winter. And the lights were out for, I think, as much as 6 weeks. And my father really cashed in on that because a few years before, he was very active in buying surplus for the store. We were an Army-Navy store. And he used to go to auctions out at Fort fort in Ayer, Massachusetts, Fort Devens. And there was an item there that they kept offering for sale, but no one would buy it. It was plumber's candles. They were round and quite big in diameter and not very tall. It was made for a plumber, would get into a space that didn't take up much room. Anyway, my father once, just for the heck of it, when they said, how much do you offer for the plumber's candles, there was a carload of them, a railroad car of them. He raised his paddle with his number on it, and he bid $5, and he got them. So we had a railroad car full of plumber's candles in the warehouse. We had a warehouse out in back of the store that my father built for $5,000 in 1925.
I bet you still have some in your garage.
Yeah, probably. If you can find them. Well, anyway, the lights were out, and no one had lights, and my father had millions of candles. He started to sell them in the store. Hannaford Brothers heard about it, and they called up my father to wholesale them to him. So my father sold them all kinds of candles. And at the end of that time, my mother got a brand new stove. Yeah, and it got some appliances, which was very nice. We didn't live on the hill too long because my father didn't like that location in stormy weather. And worst of all, the owner of the property was very upset with me because I was picking the flowers from his garden.
Even then, huh?
Yeah. So my father went out looking for a house, unbeknownst to my mother. He went with his buddy Peter McDonough, an old bachelor who was the American Tobacco Company representative in this area. And they found a beautiful, almost new white house with green shutters at 118 Dartmouth Street. It was $4,500. Yeah, it was a 6-room house on a pretty good-sized lot with a 2-car garage. Very unusual in those days because not many people owned cars, and most garages, of course, were single. And my father put a deposit on the house. He went back to the store. The phone rang. Mr. Levinsky? Yes. Are you the Mr. Levinsky that just put a deposit on a house on Dartmouth Street? He says, yes. The person said, would you be willing to accept a $500 bonus for letting your deposit, to take your deposit back and not buy the house? My father says, no, I'm not interested in making that, he says. That's the house I want to buy and raise my family in. And I guess they thought that Levinskys must have had horns or something. But anyway, we moved there in 1929. I was 3 years old. I can remember the day we moved in. Matter of fact, I can remember the day I was born. I was so surprised I didn't talk for a year. So anyway, I remember sitting on my tricycle when they moved us in, and the first person I met on the street was our immediate neighbor behind us was Jack Novick. We were within 2 months of each other, and we've been lifelong friends. I enjoyed growing up in the Oakdale area of Portland. When we moved in, this temple wasn't here, of course. There was a clay tennis court here. The street in front of us was undeveloped. In 1938, they built those 4 or 5 houses there. I remember my mother was very interested in the one that Bonnie Shore bought with a stone front. It was $8,200. And my father refused to buy it because the ceilings were too low.
I think we could hear this forever. Yes, I know we could. This story was so good. I think we'll take 2 minutes. Stand up, move around, sit down, and then we'll have questions and comments. Okay? And we'll
Hooray!
Hooray! Chucky, you were great.
You guys were so wonderful.
My grandchildren, my grandchildren, that I'm so interested that I have to push it.
Yeah. Tell me your name.
Sue Gordon. Oh. But you can't ask 2 questions until everybody at least has 1 question or comment. Comments are wonderful too. So, who wants to start? Anyone have a question or comment? Yes.
Getting back to when I was born.
You were much younger, Avy.
Actually,
And
we
handsome.
were the only Jewish family on 4th Street. You remember the boiler factory down there on 4th Street?
Yeah.
There's a little middle was completely Italian, except our family. And I remember at night my mother used to sing, "Oi Marie." Oi, Marie." I thought I was Italian. From then we moved up to Cumberland Avenue to a house on Cumberland Avenue. Then my brother was born. Then we had to move to Grant Street.
That was a nice section of town.
Yeah, you remember Grant Street, there were no drugs, none of that stuff. We had a family, the Davidsons, who were very frum. Easter Davidson and the family, they were in the corner. And one Friday, I'm sitting in the gutter. That's where I usually land in the gutter. And I'm playing, and I hear a voice say, "Come up." So I walked up the stairs, and there was Mrs. Davidson. She says, light in Yiddish, light the stove. So I lit the stove. She says, "Nem," and there was a quarter. So I took the quarter and ran. Next Friday, I'm out there again. She says, "Come up." I was the sharpest guy. All my spending money came from Mrs. Davidson. And Chucky, do you remember we used to walk home from the Hebrew school, but more in a convoy? We had to fight it. You left me on High Street and walked up. I had to go through the church on Sacred Heart Church. And they were waiting for me. It was not much fun at that time.
Thank you so much.
Yes. I have to put my 2 cents in.
Good, good.
She usually does.
Anyways, I was not born here. We came here in 1949. And we lived with my Uncle Harry Mack on Newbury Street until they found us a place to live. I didn't know they had a custom, or not a custom I should say, but a theater. If you went to the movies, you would get some dishes.
Treble Street.
Portland Theater.
You're familiar with it? You have a set?
I still got tickets from that place, if they were still open.
Well, she used to let me go to the movies. You've got to understand, I did not speak English. No. And I went. I have people that know me. But she made me go just so I can get that. I didn't want to go. She says in Yiddish, "You have to go because I need 2 more places." And I had to go and sit there and see some Verstülken of things. Just so I can carry those things. That was my experience.
There's so many great stories that we all have. I have a suggestion. I think we all ought to put these together and make a book out of it.
I think it's wonderful.
I could identify with so much of what Chucky and Phil were saying, because you know, when you're 8 or 9 or 10 years old and you're going to public school from say 8:15 in the morning until 3 or 3:30, we were picked up at Nathan Clifford School by a school bus, which was driven by an alcoholic by the name of Wallace Page. He must have hated us because we were carrying on, because you know, we were tired and we were sitting all day in school. Well then, you know, we had a chance to play, but at 4 o'clock we went back, you know, into the Hebrew school, the old Pearl Street Hebrew school. And we were there until about 6 o'clock. And the bus would take us home. By this time, my parents had moved out to Codman Street. So next to Donna Zola, I was the last kid to get out of the bus at night at 6:45. So I left home in the morning, you know, at 8 o'clock. And then I get home about 6:45. I was working longer than my father did. Incidentally, my father was a motion picture projectionist who was exiled to Portland, Maine because he wouldn't marry E.M. Lowe's sister. Lowe was a self-made millionaire who owned about 70 motion picture theaters in New England. And my father had come up in the summer of 1930 with his new bride, my mother, to be a summer replacement or a vacation replacement, which turned out to stay the rest of his life. But it was the Portland Theater that he was working at,
Is that where they gave the dish?
Yeah. I'll have you know that that theater always had a double feature and a cartoon. And one of the features was always a cowboy picture.
On Saturday.
And there were times when I got kept late because I was always cut up in school. Maybe a little crazy tired. And I would walk up to the Portland Theater to meet my father. I would go home with him on the bus because I missed the school bus because I was a bad kid. And those are wonderful memories because the balcony was empty. And my father would always bring me popcorn or candy, and I would eat that, you know, until around 7 o'clock, until by the time it was that he was going to leave. And he'd say, "So what happened today, son?" Of course, I had to tell him. One more little story. I don't want to monopolize. I was checking a name with Phil. When Lynn and I became engaged, we had a party put on in South Orange, New Jersey, by my in-laws. And at the party, there was a fellow named Sidney Weinstein. Sidney Weinstein grew up in Portland, Maine, and was a little older than you, Phil, yes? Chuck?
Yeah, he's about 87, I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's
1
a lot
year
older
old.
than you.
Little old.
Sidney Weinstein went to the Hebrew school, the old Pearl Street Hebrew School. And it wasn't knocking, but there was some other teacher. And most of these people were very poor and they were very frustrated. But he was the teacher, and the kids hated him. And he was very rough on them. He used to slap them around. It seems to go with everybody's stories, whether you're seeing a Woody Allen picture or whatever, but across America, that's what we experience. In any event, I guess he got slapped around, and he was so angry at this teacher, he was going to get even. He knew where the teacher lived, and he knew where the teacher would walk to and from his apartment, climbed a tree with a brick in his hand. The teacher walked home, and Sidney threw the brick, hit the poor man on the head. The man collapsed. He said, "Oh my God, I killed him." The next morning, the newspaper says anti-Semite assaults. Anti-Semite assaults rabbi. Well, fortunately, the man, you know, he was injured, but he survived. He was fine and kept on slapping kids around him. No one ever knew the story. And with the twinkle in his eye, this man is telling me now he's, what, 75 years of age? This is the story he was telling me 36 years ago. He said, "I was the anti-Semite."
That's great. That's great.
Here's my first cousin.
I wasn't born in Portland.
I know you're right.
After the 50 years that we lived here, I acquired a lot of knowledge about the Jewish life in Portland. A lot of them were very dirty stuff. I used to work with a fellow with the name of Mack.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know the Max too. To be honest, I really didn't.
I know this story, but the episode I want to tell you about, it happened not so long ago. A few years ago, I had a Yiddish class in the atrium. And Rita was one of my star pupils. She spoke Yiddish, but she couldn't read Yiddish too well. So one day she brought me something in Yiddish. She didn't know what was Eddie has written. Eddie, when they caught it, I think they had a group also, a Yiddish group. And Eddie wrote an essay about how he met this girl and so forth. And when I read it, then I read it to the class. First I read it to myself. I didn't want to embarrass anybody. So I read it to myself, then I read it to the class. And he wrote this way. I met about game Yiddish Mädel. I met a Jewish girl by the name of Rita. And I asked her for a date for Thursday night. And she said she could not do it because she had to flick the chicken.
Not flick, not flick, open.
Open.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Forgive me. So I decided, he says, at this time, I decided a girl that sort of uses a date and wants to open the chicken will make a good wife.
Yes. I think they might be interested in the story I have to tell. One of my sons, Dana, lived in Midland, Texas for a while, about 2 years. And I went down to visit before my husband came down at another time. So they didn't have a temple or any kind of a congregation in Midland, but 20 miles away in Odessa, Texas, there was a small congregation. It was supposedly not conservative, not orthodox, just whatever. People got together. They came as far as 50 miles away just to come to the service. And they had services there every 2 weeks. And my grandchildren went to Hebrew school there. I think it was every other Sunday. It was on the Sunday that the rabbi came from Dallas. So we went to services on a Friday night, and it was beautiful. It was really lovely. And after the service, I went over to the rabbi, and I said, I really enjoyed your sermon. And I said, I didn't catch your name. And he says, Rabbi Zimmelman. So I went, oh, Zimmelman, from where I come from, that's a common name. And he said, from your accent, I would say you were from Maine. I said, yes. And I said, we used to have a cantor, Zimmelman. And he went, my father.
Oh.
And his name was Sidney Zimmelman.
Yeah.
And I think he might have been the oldest child in the family.
Interesting.
I don't know. But he didn't go to school here because they sent him immediately to the yeshiva when he was old enough. And but he was here in I think he said 47 or 48. And it was just like old home week. It was wonderful. He was a retired rabbi from Dallas, and he would fly to the Odessa Midland airport every other week, and they had an apartment set up for he and his wife, who was absolutely lovely. And it just felt wonderful to meet somebody from Portland and Odessa, Texas.
Anyone else have comments?
I have a
Rita,
story
yes.
about my husband, as I told you, was a part-time Hebrew teacher. And one day I went into Rhines Brothers in the basement to buy a pair of slippers. And when I gave my charge card to the sales clerk, she saw Weisberg. She said, are you any relation to Mr. Weisberg, the Hebrew teacher? And I said, yes, he's my husband. Well, she looked at me very peculiarly. She was talking about David Lewis's grandfather,
Right.
who was a well-known Hebrew teacher.
Robert's Hebrew school teacher. It was probably my mother-in-law.
No, it was a non-Jewish.
Oh.
I have one, about the Portland Theater. This is very quick. There used to be a kid who came every Saturday. We went Saturday afternoons, and beside dishes, we used to get popcorn, magazines, and I still have free tickets that my cousin, he was the ticket taker. I still got the tickets from there, but I never used him. But there was a kid that used to go Saturday afternoons, and Tom Mix, they always showed the Tom Mix. Remember the Tom Mix? And they always had Tom Mix. He was the good guy on a horse, and the train was on this side. He was running after the bandits, and it was a question of who was going to hit who. And he says, I hope they get that bastard. Every Saturday afternoon.
And how much was it to go to the movies?
Well, I went free. My cousin was a ticket taker.
It was 10 cents.
Remember
It was
Jerry
10
Oransky?
cents. Yeah.
Remember Jerry? Yes, Jerry.
But if you were Jewish and you were kosher, you couldn't go because you weren't supposed to handle money.
That's right.
So you bought your ticket Friday evening before the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And your mother packed a lunch for you and a bag of lunch so you could stay for 2 shows.
So, right?
Yeah. I used to go to the Cameo Theater.
Yeah,
That's
that-
where the
that-
Great Lost Bear is, and that was 10 cents. And then when World War II came, of course, they had the entertainment tax, and it went up to 11 cents. Yeah.
I'm also not from Portland, Maine, but I came up in 1956 from New York City. And I used to go to dances, and it was usually sponsored by Hadassah, or it was sponsored by B'nai B'rith. It wasn't until I came to Portland that I realized these were real organizations. And as a result, I became life member of Hadassah. But what impressed me about well, after the initial shock of landing at the airport, which was nothing like it is today. Today it's the International Airport. When I landed, I came from New York, left LaGuardia, landed in a cow pasture. The only thing paved was the runway, and you could smell the grass. It had just been cut. I came up in July, and it was, great. And that was my initial shock. And then thinking that I had to go back on that same plane to New York, I was a little nervous. I was wondering how that plane would ever take off. Well, I found out. Back then, the plane was on an angle like this, and you had to climb up to your seat so that the plane could actually take off. And I'll make this short. For all of you here, if you ever heard Phil tell the story about my coming up those summer months to be with Murray because he thought we weren't married, and he passed that rumor around for years. This girl from New York was coming up and staying with Murray at the Ambassador Hotel. And it wasn't until several years ago that he mentioned it. And I said, Phil, we were married. We were married in May, and I wasn't coming up until And the other thing that impressed me about Portland, Maine, is I once bought a tube of lipstick when I first got here. It must have cost me about 50 cents. And I bought it from Portland Mitchell. And I brought it home, and I said to my neighbor, I was living at Forest Park at the time, and I said, gee, I really don't like this shade. I have to go back into town tomorrow to return it. She says, don't be foolish. Call them up. They'll pick it up. I said, for 50 cents. Sure enough, I called Porches. The next day, the truck came and picked up a little bit of lipstick. And Forest Park at that time was called Little Tel Aviv. As a matter of fact, Bob and Ann Rosen were my neighbors, and our president, Elaine and Judy, played in the courtyard out there, kids growing up. So we have a long relationship. But I always loved Portland, and I always told Murray, you can go wherever you want, but I'm never leaving Portland.
I got a question. Next door to Shirley, wasn't there a Hebrew school teacher that moved in near you? And I would play with my friends, and it was my Hebrew school teacher, so we would find in the back of the A&P a great big cotton, and I would go into the cotton, and they would drag me around for the day, so the Hebrew school teacher didn't know that I was out playing.
And this is our president.
We have one more time. No
Well,
more stories?
When my children were growing up, which was in the 60s, Hebrew school wasn't very different in those days either for the cab driver. because I can remember him delivering my kids to our driveway, and them running up the driveway and him following them,
Chasing them.
chasing them. Yeah, it's tough. Yes.
Did the waterfront have any call or attraction for the Jewish community at all? I used to spend some time down here in my late teenage years, on the dragons and fishing.
Working, you mean? Working?
Did anybody have any shops? I didn't,
Yeah, Bernstein and Jacobson. Yeah, Bernstein and Jacobson, they used to have a lot of waterfront business. They were in the junk business, and they also had, they also used to provide transportation to island people if there was a bad storm. Levi Bernstein, let him rest in peace, who was a partner with Jake Jacobson, he couldn't swim a stroke, but they tell the story about terrible storms when the ships went running to Peace Island and Long Island, what have you. He'd take them out in his little boat with a little motor behind it and bring him back and forth. He was quite a guy. One day I met him in Rice's Bakery, and we used to go there quite often, and I was buying some of Mrs. Rice's delicious pastries, and he came up to me and he said, "You shouldn't be eating that stuff. It's not good for you. You should eat nothing but salt, pork, and beans." So I told his daughter, Helen Bernstein Cook, about that, and he says, "Philip, he brings home bags full of pastries from Rice's." Yeah.
Well, actually, too, there used to be a boat. Peaks Island was a big spot for us to have fun in on Sundays. We used to go out there, play ball. There were dances out there that was before my time, but we used to go to Peaks Island on the boat, and that was a big thing for us in Portland, to go out there and have all kinds of games and have fun on a Sunday.
And during the Hebrew school days, we used to have a picnic once a year on Long Island.
Right.
That was a beautiful place.
Yeah.
The beach?
Long Island, yeah.
With Dr. Needleman, if they remember. Dr. Needleman ran it.
Dr. Bill Needleman, great guy, yeah.
Wait, I see a hand that hasn't said anything yet.
I was just going to say, I notice there's so much similarities to the stories that are being told here. People that grew up in Portland. I grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts, but a lot
Really,
of
you
things-
don't look it.
I was born there.
So many similarities. And one thing I remember that was so funny, and I think it was very similar to the story wanting to be told about the movies. For 10 cents, we would go to this particular theater, and you could spend all day there. There'd be the news and the cereal and the cartoons and 2 movies, all for 10 cents.
Well, Mark, I have one even better. There used to be at the State Theater a quiz show called
Recess time.
Recess Time.
I want a radio.
Yeah, you want a radio? So we went early in the morning, saw the program, brought our lunch, ate it up in the balcony before the movie started. Then we had the 2 movies, the previews, the cartoons, and the newsreel. And if you wanted, you could stay again.
Wasn't there a cereal
Yeah.
that was considered very weak?
Yeah,
Well,
that's
no.
what I was saying, but when I went, yeah, in Lowell there was.
No, I'm too young.
And right up on Congress Street, the Portland Public Library was a magnificent place on Congress Street, opposite what was the Main Hardware. That strip right now, on Congress Street, where the Chinese restaurants and things like that.
Pagoda.
Portland Public Library was the spot. It was right there. The building is still there. It was magnificent. And there used to be a lady who told story. Was it on a Saturday morning? What was her name?
Lila Abbott.
Oh, yeah, at the library. Miss Abbott.
It was wonderful.
Miss Abbott.
Wonderful.
Judy?
I loved her. I also didn't grow up in Portland, but my mother, who Mrs. Rice, I think remembers, so she told me, by the way, I should ask about your brother because she dated him.
Yep.
He used to come on the train from Bangor. Except sometimes I think they used to hitchhike, but I don't know. She and her sister, because she had a married sister living, and they would go to dances at the center. And this was a connect with the Jewish communities that continued into when I was in high school. That connection. I don't think it's so strong now. But she was married on Francis Street in 1945 in her sister's house. And she had aunts here, and I had a cousin.
Oh, you mean Ann?
Ann.
Yeah, she worked at the temple in the office.
Oh, she did really?
Yes, and she used to say, she used to be very annoyed sometimes with Rabbi Sky.
Oh, I see.
And she said, and she used to say that she didn't know whether to quit or stay and write a book about him.
She was quite a lady. And another cousin, an aunt of my mother's, who must have been your neighbor, Phil, the Wymans on Dartmouth Street.
Oh,
and you
sure.
may know, some of you may remember Margie Wyman, who became Margie Wyman Shaman, who became quite a well-known children's author.
Right.
And those of you who ever read Nate the Great to your kids, Nate the Great was Nathan Wyman, who was my great uncle who lived here in Portland and had some kind of wholesale business. Yeah?
Sure.
Wyman brothers.
He was the most wonderful man in the world, your uncle. He was a
My
sweetheart.
my mother's maiden name was
Sweetheart.
her sister's name was Ann Levine, and her aunt's name was Ann Wyman, and her other aunt was Minnie Lillian.
Her Ann's husband owned Excel Dry Clean.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
My children used to say, run in the house, Mrs. Valine is
And
coming
your
with her
sister's
car.
working for
That's how she wrote, Valine. That's what she wrote down the street. Mrs. Valine is coming with her car.
We're almost down to the wire, but there's time for one more person.
Thank you. I'm Dina Weinstein. I live up in Garland. Been here for 33 years. And I just wanted to say, I'm related to the Goffins of Vesper Street of Montjoy Hill. Arlene Goffin and her two sisters were our close relatives. And Arlene will get a full report today, and I call her. She lives in St. Louis now. But last year, just 2 years ago, I guess, her son brought her here, and they visited with us. They went back to the house on Vesper, and those people allowed them to walk through the house. They saw the whole house again. Yes.
I saw Eileen with her two sisters on Congress Street. They were visiting the Etzheim Synagogue a few years ago.
They come back to the cemetery almost every year.
Okay. One more, and then we're done.
We're talking about Pete's Island. During the war, we had a place on Pete's Island, and I worked at Sears Roebuck.
Stand up, honey, be on the
And I had my own producer.
That's great. So I wish it was inside,
on Long Island, and I worked at Sears Roebuck. Saturday night, the boats left, I think, a little about 9:30, the last boat. Well, we had to work till 9 o'clock, so I always ran, and I missed it most of the time. But getting back to the island, where we were, there was people next to us, and there was this fellow always taking movies. And I says, who is that? As I'm a Sugarnadotin. It's crazy. What's it? He has a camera, and he goes up and down, he takes pictures of the flowers. That was John Ford. But